reading Cahiers du Cinema, the 1950s, Neo-Realism, Hollywood, New Wave, by David Wilson and Jim Hillier. Preface. When this anthology of selections from Cahiers du Cinema was first discussed, it was planned that each volume should be self-contained and coherent within its own terms, should be representative of the period covered. In this case, some 9 years and over 100 issues of the magazine, should contain largely newly translated material rather than material already easily available in English, should be relevant and useful within contemporary film culture and film education, and should be pleasurable and accessible. I hope that this somewhat tall order has been filled to a large extent, but some of the requirements have worked against each other. If, for example, work by Andre Bazin, Jean-Luc Godard, and Francois Truffaut is not as fully represented in the volume as their importance to Cahiers would merit, this is because a great deal of their critical work is already available in English. And the same goes for the work on Renoir, for example. At the same time, not to have represented Bazin, Godard, and Truffaut by important writings would have been quite wrong. As a result, all three are represented here, both by some already available material and and by some newly translated contributions. In any case, what could being, quote, representative, end quote, of Cahiers mean? Question mark. It could be taken to mean several rather different things. Representative of contributions by quantity or by importance, at the time or in retrospect, or representative of the magazine's broad range of concerns. This volume is, I think, generally representative in most of these ways, but I am conscious that, among other omissions, some Cahiers contributors, often with long and important associations with the magazine between 1951 and 1959, are poorly or not at all represented. I have in mind, for example, Jacques Deniol Valcruz, represented here only in discussions, Louis Marcarels, independently minded in his interest in such areas as Polish cinema and New York American cinema, Andre Martin, specialist in animation and comedy, Claude Bailly, Renard specialist, Francois Mars, comedy specialist, Jean Duchette, Philippe Damin-Sablon, Andre S. Labarthe, Claude D. Givray, Jacques Sislier, and from the early years, Jean-Jose Richer and Michel Dorsday, as well as many others. There is no intention to underestimate the value of their work. In some cases, their work is likely to be included in future volumes. In some other cases, examples of their work are available elsewhere in translation. Apex 2, a guide to Cahiers articles from the period April 1951 to December 1959 in translation, is designed very precisely to extend the necessarily limited scope of this volume, and hence its usefulness by pointing to other Cahiers and related material available in English. No definitive listing of such material exists, and our listing, although the best we have been able to achieve, is almost certainly incomplete. We would be grateful for additions and or corrections from readers. It has proved difficult to fix upon an appropriate structure for the book, but attempts to organize it by critics or chronology or theoretical issues, for example, seem less successful than the present structure. Certainly the major categories which provide the book structure, French cinema, American cinema, Italian cinema, polemics, were meaningful ones, though certainly not the only ones, for Cahiers during the 1950s. I have felt this perspective to be generally important in the sense that I have preferred to work broadly within the critical work's own terms rather than constantly to subject it to a critique whose terms belong to much later debates. On the other hand, I have wanted to make it clear in my introductions, particularly my general introduction, what kinds of relationships exist between the work of Cahiers in this period and later work in Cahiers and elsewhere, and why. In my introductions to each section, I have tried to tease out some of the major critical threads and and implications in the material, as well as to relate it both to other Cahiers material and to its influence on contemporary and later work in English. Hence the, I hope, productive and suggestive profusion of footnote references. A note on translations. Translation always poses problems about accurate rendition, especially when, as in this case, several different translators are involved and some of the original writing is quite difficult or dense. In particular, I should point out that the French auteur is usually, but not always, retained when, quote, author, end quote, would have been the straight translation, and mise en scène when, quote, direction, end quote, would have been the likely translation. Both terms have entered critical discussion in English, but auteur in particular did not always have the meanings currently attached to it. We have tried to be sensitive to the varying usage of the two terms. Les Cahiers du Cinema, literally cinema exercise, or quote, cinema exercise or notebooks, end quote, are of course plural and should perhaps be referred to as, quote, they, end quote, but we have preferred to refer to cahiers as if in the singular. Cahiers is the normal abbreviation used. Notes and references. All notes are the editor's except where specifically designated as authors or translators' notes. A number of books referred to in notes with some frequency are given in abbreviated form in references. Full details are provided under, quote, books frequently cited in text, end quote, on pages 12 through 13. Acknowledgements. My principal debts relate less to this particular volume than to the more general perspective which informs it. First, like any teacher, my greatest debts are to my students. Over a period of almost 15 years at British Film Institute summer schools, at BFI, University of London, extramural classes, and at Bulmersh College of Higher Education, their puzzlements and excitements, their understandings and insights, constantly renewed, have always been the most vital stimulus. Second, over the past 15 years or so, I have been fortunate to find myself among colleagues whose ideas, interests, and enthusiasms have also been constantly stimulating my colleagues at BFI Education and on BFI Summer Schools 1969 through 1979, on the editorial board of Movie, and in the Film and Drama Division at Bulmersh College. To all of them, my continuing thanks. The value I place on some of these colleagues should be clear from my references to their work, but I do not place less value on the less visible or available work of the others. Third, very specific thanks to BFI Library Services, whose help is so fundamental to this book as to so many others, and to my editors, Angela Martin and David Wilson. Belrose Gandhi has been both support and stimulus, and she and my children, Joachim and Amy, have suffered from time spent with Cahiers, which should have been spent with them. My thanks and apologies to them. In my own formation, the late Patty Winnell, my first film teacher, later a colleague at BFI Education and a friend, was probably the most important single influence. The vitality of British film culture, publications, education, exhibition over the last 20 years owes a great deal to Patty's work and to the spirit in which he undertook it. More than has been generally acknowledged, I miss him, and this book is dedicated to the memory of him and his work. Chapters 3, 4, 13, and 14, translated by Tom Milne, are reprinted from Godard on Godard, edited by Jean Nurbani and Tom Milne. Martin Secker, copyright Martin Secker and Warburg, 1972. Chapter 16, translated by Russell Campbell and Marvin Pister, originally appeared in Focus on Howard Hawks, edited by J. McBride, Prince Hall and Spectrum Books, 1972. It is adapted from a translation by Adrian Brine, which appeared in Movie, December 1962. Chapters 19 and 26, translated by Tom Milne, are reprinted from Rivet, editors J. Rosenbaum, copyright British Film Institute, 1977. Chapter 31, translated by Peter Graham, is reprinted from The New Wave, editor Peter Graham, copyright Martin Secker and Warburg, 1968. And I was reading the preface and acknowledgements to Cahiers du Cinema, the 1950s, Neo-Realism, Hollywood, New Wave, by Jim Hillier and David Wilson.